We should be at the same place in both classes, so it shouldn't make any difference. And yesterday we went through and we talked about trouble in Cuba, and we talked about the sinking of the USS Maine and the United States declaring war on Spain. And then we talked about that the first battle of the Spanish-American War was not in Cuba, but in the Philippines, right? And now we're going to talk about America prepares for war. We got to get ourselves ready, okay? Now, what was kind of the problem in other wars we kind of got ourselves into right after we declared war? Anybody remember an issue we sometimes had, most often?
We weren't prepared.
Weren't prepared. We didn't have any troops ready. Well, it just so happened that the day that the United States declared war upon Spain, we had more than 30,000 American troops ready to go. So this would be a war in which we were not that unprepared at the start. So the day that we declared war on Spain, the American military had 30,000 troops ready to go. Now, I want you to think about this. If you were the United States President and you were going to send half of those troops somewhere to be prepared in case Spain attacked you somewhere, where would you send them? Well, we don't know in Cuba. If you're afraid you're getting close. If you're afraid Florida, you'd send them to Florida. So Mckinley sent 17,000 of those 30,000 troops to Tampa, Florida, just in case the Spanish decided they would attack the American mainland from Cuba. So 17,000 of those 30,000 troops were sent to Tampa, Florida in case of a Spanish attack. The other 13,000 were deployed in other areas, and we'll talk about that later. Now, as Lincoln did prior to the Civil War, McKinley felt it would be important to have more soldiers on hand, so he did the same thing Lincoln did. And what did Lincoln do at the outbreak of Civil War? Well, but he asked, to get him there, he what? Asked for people to volunteer, and that's what McKinley did. After he sent the 17,000 troops to Tampa, Florida, he then asked for volunteers to fight in the Spanish-American War, and over 200,000 men volunteered. So shortly after sending the 17,000 troops to Tampa, Florida, in case of a Spanish attack there, the president then publicly asked for volunteers to fight in the Spanish-American War, and more than 200,000 men volunteered. Guess who was among the volunteers? Familiar name? What? Say it. Theodore Roosevelt, who resigned his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and joined the cause. And they would let him lead an American cavalry unit in the Spanish-American War known as the Rough Riders. So among the 200,000 men who volunteered was Theodore Roosevelt himself. He resigned his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and during the Spanish-American conflict, which we'll talk about in a bit, Roosevelt would lead an American cavalry unit known as the Rough Riders. Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is the Spanish-American War, a summer long. How long did we fight in the war, Ryland? 3 months, just about 3 months. It was pretty short. So the Spanish-American War, a summer long. Now, kind of prep in your mind that who controls Cuba? Spain. And where's usually all the power in a country located? Capital city. Very good. So the main objective for the United States military, as far as Cuba was concerned, was to capture the port city, although it wasn't the capital city, the port city of Santiago. Often you capture a capital city, but why would a port city be important? Yeah. Well, and who else's navy's probably in there? Spanish. So, okay. So the main objective for the United States military in Cuba was to capture the port city of Santiago. The Spanish Atlantic Fleet, the entire Spanish fleet that served and protected the Atlantic Ocean area, was docked in Santiago Harbor. And the city of Santiago was set on top of a hill known as San Juan hills. So what you have geographically is you have Santiago, which is on a hill, the city's up on top of the hill, and what's below the hill? The harbor where the Spanish fleet is. So they got a defended area, right? I mean, they're up in the air. So again, the main objective for the United States military in Cuba was to capture the port city of Santiago. The Spanish Atlantic fleet was docked in Santiago Harbor, and the city of Santiago was set up on top of a hill known as San Juan Hill. San Juan Hill. Well, on June 24th of 1898, June 24th of 1898, Spanish and American armies clashed. Because this isn't just going to be a naval battle, is it? Nope. We're going to have troops on the ground. So on June 24th, 1898, Spanish and American armies clashed. And who led the charge up San Juan Hill towards Santiago? Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, the American cavalry. So on June 24th, 1898, Spanish and American armies clashed, and Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders led the charge of San Juan Hill toward Santiago. The fighting was very hard fighting. Roosevelt lost 1,500 men during the conflict, but in the end, the hills surrounding Santiago were captured by the United States. So Roosevelt charges with the Rough Riders. In the process of capturing these hills that surround that city, in the process of capturing San Juan Hill, Roosevelt does lose 1,500 men during the hard fighting, but they do capture the hills that surround it. Now the city wasn't quite lost yet, but the hills surrounded were captured, so it's not coming, it's not going to be too long. So if you're the Spanish and you see that they're about ready to lose the port city, what are you going to try to do with your fleet? Get it out of there before they sink it to the bottom of the harbor. Okay? So the Spaniards, seeing that the city was near lost, tried to escape their big fleet from the harbor, get out of there and save the fleet. Well, if you look at the next ID, what did they run into? The USS Oregon, a battleship that had hemmed them in. So the Spanish fleet was met by an American Pacific fleet, which was led by the battleship USS Oregon. So the Spanish fleet is going to try to escape the harbor before they can be destroyed. Unfortunately for them, they were met by an American Pacific fleet, which was more than one ship, that was led by the battleship USS Oregon. In a very short time, the Spanish fleet sank the American fleet sank the Spanish fleet to the bottom of Santiago Harbor. So in a short time, the American fleet sank the Spanish fleet to the bottom of the harbor in the Caribbean Sea. Still, Santiago had not surrendered. It did take another week for the city of Santiago to be under siege. They finally surrendered a week after their fleet was sunk. And as a result of that surrender of Santiago, both the islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico were free from Spanish rule. And during the course of simply a summer, the Spanish-American War came to an end. So what are we worried about now? The spoils of war. Because although we acted like we weren't after anything, let's see if we get some out of it. Okay? So the spoils of war for the United States. There were four things the United States gained from the Spanish-American War. Four things. Some were possessions, some were just yeah. Okay? There were four things that the United States gained from the victory over Spain in the Spanish-American War. First of them was simply a yeah thing. They received freedom for the Cubans from Spanish rule. So the Cuban citizens were freed from Spanish rule. And what was the rumor going in? What was the rumor going in, Peyton, that we were going to take if we won this war? Cuba. And we didn't, by God, but you know what we did take? We took Puerto Rico. So the second thing we gained was possession of the country of Puerto Rico. So when you hear that Puerto Rico is a United States possession or territory, right? This is where it came from. So possession of the country of Puerto Rico. We also got a very important island in the Pacific Ocean called Guam. And that, why would that island be important in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Andrew, at home?
Base.
Military bases, absolutely. Keep a better eye on the Pacific Ocean and with the surrounding area. Because you got Japan there and you got China. So we also gained possession of the land of Guam, island of Guam, which we'll talk about when we get into World War II. Pretty important island. So we gained possession of the island of Guam. And what was the final thing we got that we talked about before? That we went into and took possession of, but I said we didn't own them yet. The Philippine Islands. But we were kind about that. We just didn't take the Philippines. After the Spanish-American War, we gave Spain $20 million for that. We probably didn't have to, but we really didn't own them. We just occupied them. And so we negotiated with Spain, and we bought the Philippine Islands for $20 million. So the four things that were gained by the United States in their victory over Spain in the Spanish-American War: freedom for the Cubans from Spanish rule, possession of the country of Puerto Rico, possession of the island of Guam in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and we for sure owned the Philippine Islands, paying Spain $20 million for them. Now, this was a good deal, and Secretary of State John Hay liked what we got so much out of the Spanish-American War that he called the Spanish-American War that splendid little war. So it was a war of possessions, although we didn't lie. We weren't interested in Cuba, but we ended up with Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines out of the deal. Okay? And Secretary of State John Hay referred publicly to the Spanish-American War as that splendid little war that gained us those four ideals and three possessions. Ever hear about to the victor belong the spoils? We've talked about that. What we got out of this victory was some pretty important country. All right, that's going to take us to another presidential election, the election of 1900. We've really covered the ground, haven't we, on elections? Who's our president? Charles Rischel? McClellan was the Civil War general. We didn't get the Mick part. McKinley. William McKinley is our president. Can he run for re-election? Sure he can. Will he run for re-election? Yes, he will. And he will be easily nominated by his party. So the Republican Party will nominate President William McKinley for re-election. A no-brainer, no questions, no controversy. Now, what's going to be the issue on the Republican Party? Who are we going to nominate for the vice presidency? And whose name kept coming up? Theodore Roosevelt. Okay, Theodore Roosevelt's name kept coming up. Now, Theodore Roosevelt, after the Spanish-American War, had been elected governor of New York. So he was in a political position at the time. So after the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt had been elected governor of New York. And he was kind of reluctant to give up that governorship to be vice president, because some people think that being the vice president might be the closest thing to falling off the face of the earth politically, right? Matter of fact, going into next year, John Kennedy, who was not a very experienced politician, was elected president. Lyndon Johnson is vice president. Lyndon Johnson was the Speaker of the House of, or excuse me, was the Senate Majority Leader, which has a lot of power. When he accepted the vice presidency, he lost every bit of power he had. And they said it was the most miserable time in his life, is when he was vice president. So you can see why Roosevelt's thinking, I'm governor of one of the most populated states in the country. Do I want to give that up to be vice president? So he was reluctant, but he finally gave up the governorship of New York and put his name on the ticket for vice president. And they had their ticket, the McKinley-Roosevelt ticket. It's going to be a pretty big decision when you hear what happens later. Who'd the Democrats try again? William Jennings Bryan. Again, the Democrats nominated William Jennings Bryan. And so this is really going to be kind of a replay of the race in 1896, is it not? What's the only thing we're missing? Very good. The Populist Party won't be involved this time. So it's really a replay of the prior election without the Populist Party. Well, this was interesting because Bryan got after it. I mean, he campaigned vigorously clear across the country. He really put an effort out. McKinley rarely ventured very far from the White House. He did absolutely no campaigning. He just thought his reputation would work. William Jennings Bryan was campaigning all over the country to no avail, because when the dust cleared, McKinley gathered 292 electoral votes and Bryan had 155. So even though he campaigned vigorously across the country and McKinley sat on his duff at home, McKinley wins the election fairly easily, 292 to 155. Why? He didn't put out any effort. How could he win? Yes, he had great popularity for the Spanish-American War, and people viewed his presidency as very successful. He didn't even hardly politic or campaign. So McKinley gathers 292 electoral votes to Bryan's 155 and is re-elected President of the United States. Okay, that'll take us to his profile. I'll tell you about William McKinley and his life and death. Another one of these Ohio guys, right? William McKinley was born on January 29th, 1843 in Niles, Ohio. William McKinley was born on January 29th, 1843 in Niles, N-I-L-E-S, Niles, Ohio. What's his ancestry? What's that? No. Irish. Yeah, Irish. He was of Irish ancestry. His great-great-grandfather actually sailed to America in 1743 from Ireland and set up the McKinley family in America. So his great-great-grandfather sailed to America in 1743 and brought the McKinley family to America. Yeah, interesting. Now, McKinley, as all these guys did, they attended elementary and high school in the state of Ohio, and then he went to Allegheny College. Allegheny College. But he couldn't stay there. He was forced to return home from college, because what happened in history? Civil War. Very good. Civil War came about. So he was forced to return home from college with the outbreak of the Civil War. And when Lincoln asked for 75,000 volunteers, McKinley was the first man from Niles, Ohio, to put his name on the list. So when Lincoln asked for those 75,000 volunteers after the beginning of the Civil War, it was William McKinley who was the first man from Niles, Ohio, to volunteer. He fought in the Battle of Antietam. His job was to bring food and supplies to Union troops, which was a pretty important job. Didn't carry a rifle, but they don't do well without eating. And because of his bravery under the face of fire during the Battle of Antietam, carrying food and supplies to troops, he was promoted to the rank of second lieutenant. So he didn't have a rifle in his hand at Antietam, but he had a very important job of getting food and supplies to the troops. And he did that under duress, under fire, and because of his display of bravery, William McKinley was promoted to the rank of second lieutenant. He left the Civil War with the rank of major. Left the Civil War with the rank of major. And in 1871, he married Ida Saxton. 1871, he married Ida Saxton. And he entered politics. Now we told you this, but you can write it down if you want to, but we told you this when he was running for election the first time. Remember, he served in the House of Representatives. He also was elected governor of Ohio prior to being nominated for the presidency. And he actually was a serious presidential candidate in 1892, but he lost the nomination to Benjamin Harrison. So he had been mentioned just a little bit in these elections. We know that he was elected President of the United States in 1896, and we know that he was re-elected in 1900. You don't really have to write that stuff down, but you do need to know this, or write it down anyway. On September 6th of 1901, he was in Buffalo, New York at a speaking engagement. On September 6th of 1901, he was in Buffalo, New York at a speaking engagement. And what happened, Brian?
He was assassinated.
Okay, I'll give you the details. He's got it right, but I'll give you the details.
Wow.
Yep. When President McKinley reached out to shake hands with a supposed supporter, an estranged man shot him, hiding a concealed revolver in a handkerchief in his right hand. So, on September 6, 1901, President McKinley was in Buffalo, New York at a speaking engagement when the president reached out to shake hands with a supposed supporter. An estranged man hiding a revolver in the handkerchief in his right hand shot McKinley twice. So on September 6, 1901, President McKinley was in Buffalo, New York at a speaking engagement when the president reached out to shake hands with a supposed supporter. An estranged man shot him, hiding a concealed revolver in a handkerchief in his right hand. Shot him twice. McKinley was immediately rushed to a hospital for emergency surgery. McKinley was immediately rushed to a hospital for emergency surgery. Now, Brian, did it at first look like he was going to recover from these wounds?
Yeah.
Yeah, but he didn't. He died on September 14th, 1901. So it first looked like he would recover from his wounds, but he did eventually died on September 14th, 1901.